Let me introduce Andy Hait. Andy Hait has been, he's been with the Census Bureau for over 30 years, and he has presented here at New Mexico, last 10 years or so that I can think about. So he's been a regular at our conferences. He works with the Economic Census data, which is such a vital and important data set for those of us who are looking for business information. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Andy Hait.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this session today. As Susan said, I've presented at the New Mexico SDC conference a number of years. In fact, I think, Susan, I'm up to 8 now. It's either 8 or 9. And I will tell you that of all the SDCs that I've presented at, New Mexico's is the one I presented the most at, and it is also my favorite. And so I'm not trying to pander here to the audience, but I truly love working with you all. I wish I was there in person, but unfortunately, in these days, we can't all get what we want. So we're having to do this virtually. So today's session is going to be primarily about the economic census, but since I did a webinar for Susan back in July on an update of where we were with the economic census, I'm only going to touch on a little bit about the econ census, talk about what it is and why should you care about it, very briefly talk about what we've released so far and what's going to be coming in the next even couple of days, 2 days exactly, and then talk a little bit about how you all can use data from the economic census and some tips specifically for New Mexico because your state does have some challenges with the economic census data that other states don't have. Some larger states, for example, don't have. So I want to give you some tips on how to use that. However, today's session is going to be a bit more about the annual business survey, which is a program that we conduct at Census that replaced the survey of business owners, which is that program that we used to do every 5 years that publishes information on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. And I want to talk a little bit about this new ABS, and also about how you all can address some of the gaps in the data that are true for the current vintage ABS, but that will be addressed in the future. And then we'll talk a little bit about, share some key findings for the state of New Mexico. But the majority of my session is going to be a live demo. First, I'm going to start off with a demo of the COVID-19 Data Hub. This is a platform that we stood up back in April to provide selected information about the potential impacts of the pandemic on our American households and on businesses. In that demo, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 key COVID programs. Those include the business formation statistics, our 2 pulse surveys, the small business and household pulse surveys, and then finally community resilience estimates. I see I can't spell estimates. I forgot the I, so I'll fix that. And when I do that demo, I'm going to focus specifically on New Mexico. So let's kind of get started. I love starting presentations off with this slide. It's sort of the shock and awe slide. It helps make people aware that we do a lot more at the Census Bureau than just simply count the U.S. population once every 10 years. We do more than 130 monthly, quarterly, annual, and periodic programs each and every single year. They include demographic programs like the Decennial Census and the American Community Survey, but they also include 58 business programs, monthly, quarterly, annual, and periodic surveys that measure American businesses. Every 5 years, we do an economic census that is our most comprehensive look at American business. And along with the economic census, we conduct a census of governments. So this looks at the public sector versus the private sector. When you think about those 58 surveys, a pyramid is a nice way of sort of thinking about those business surveys because it conveys 2 pieces of information. First, it helps folks understand the hierarchy of these programs. The fact that our monthly and quarterly surveys, which are very, very timely, are baselined and benchmarked back to our annual programs, which are slightly more detailed, and then those are baselined and benchmarked back to the Economic Census. The key point here is that if we don't get a good count of all businesses in the U.S. every 5 years, then all of those annual, quarterly, and monthly programs that are baselined and benchmarked back to the Economic Census would then be challenged. It would have an issue. So Pyramid does a great job of kind of displaying that hierarchy, but it also is a good tool to explain something about the level of detail that is shown. Our monthly and quarterly surveys are very, very timely, but they produce very limited statistics. Most of the monthly surveys are only available at the national level. There's no geographic dimension. Most of those monthly surveys are fairly limited in terms of the industry detail that is shown. You don't have the full industry coverage. And finally, most of those monthly surveys only produce a very small number of variables. So for example, the monthly retail sales report publishes one statistic, retail sales. It is broken out by industry for retail industries, but there's no geography. It's national data only. So these are really timely surveys, but pretty limited in terms of the detail. At the opposite extreme, though, is the Economic Census. The opposite of timely, sort of the anti-timely, but very detailed in terms of the information that we publish. This slide provides a little bit of information about the Econ Census and what are all those different details that we publish. It's the most detailed program in terms of industry coverage, geography, other dimensions, and the data variables. Also, this is the only program that we conduct at the Census Bureau that publishes comprehensive product line data. Product line data are information about the detailed products and services provided by businesses. So, for example, if you were a restaurateur and you were considering offering a drive-through service on your business, of course, today, it's hard to imagine a restaurant not offering drive-through given the pandemic limitations that we have going on. But if you were running a business and did not have drive-through, understanding how much drive-through makes a difference of other businesses like yours could be really useful. And that type of product line detail, how are restaurants selling their products to their customers, that's part of our product line breakout, and those data can be really valuable. And we talked a little bit about that in the July webinar. I then talked about the release schedule, that we started releasing the data back in September. We currently, when I was doing the July webinar, we were currently in the midst of releasing our geographic area data. That's where all the information for New Mexico is primarily released. Data are shown at the national, state, metropolitan area, county, and even place levels in these geographic area statistics. And that series was actually completed right after the July webinar. Middle of August, we completed the complete geographic area series. It was a little bit ahead of our planned November release, so I'm pretty happy that we got that completed. On Thursday, we are going to be releasing the NAPS data, those product statistics data. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. These are these detailed product lines. And the week after that, we will be releasing the first of our business size reports in what we call the establishment and firm size statistics. Those include data broken out by the employment and revenue size of the business, and whether that business is a individual business location or a firm. The data are broken out that way as well. And then going into next year, we will be releasing the other remaining reports. In that July release, I talked to you all about this really nice graphic resource that we had to help people understand what's been released. And as you can see, as of this slide here, we had reached 83%. We're now at 100%. And some of you may say, okay, well, now that they've completed releasing all these geographic area data, why would I want to care about this thing? As some of you might have experienced, our data.census.gov application, our tool, a very powerful tool, does have some usability challenges. Users sometimes do struggle a little bit getting to the data they need, So in this visualization, we actually included direct links to the data. So if I was interested in looking at data on the retail sector in New Mexico, I could choose retail trade from the little menu there at the top. I could then click on the state of New Mexico, and in the little pop-up box that would come up would be a direct link to the retail data for New Mexico, and it would bring me right to that data in data.census.gov without having to go through any of the menus to find it. So even though we've completed the release, this tool is still pretty useful, and I've included the link to it in the upper left-hand corner. As I just mentioned, we are getting ready to release on Thursday the NAPS data, the North American Product Classification data. It's a pretty substantial change in the way the product lines data were released in the past, and I'm actually going to be doing a webinar on December 1st where we'll walk through the North American Product Classification System and the data. So if you're interested in learning more about these product data, I would love it if you were able to join me on December 1st. There is a link to the webinar on our scheduled webinars page. On December 8th, I'm going to be doing a webinar on the establishment and firm size report. Those data will start coming out right at the very beginning of December, and right after that, I'm going to be doing a webinar on that. And again, I'd love to see you there. So that brings us to where can I go to access all this economic census data? Of course, they are available in the Quick Facts data tool. They are also available primarily in data.census.gov, but I just recently added the economic census data, or part of it, to Census Business Builder. Version 3.2, which was released back in October, does have data from the economic census for New Mexico in this data tool, and we will be releasing at the end of December or beginning of January version 3.3. I won't have a chance today to do a CBB demo, but I would love it if you guys were using this, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me about it. So let's talk a little bit about how you all in New Mexico could use the economic census data. The first thing that I want to point out, and this is my chance to get up on my soapbox for a moment, and that is that when you are using Census Bureau data, and I would even argue all time series data, before you start comparing the data over time, you need to make sure that the thing that you are comparing is in fact comparable. As many of you know, geography boundaries change. We haven't added a state to the United States in a while, but county boundaries do periodically change, but even more frequently, metropolitan areas change as well as place boundaries. In fact, going from the 2012 economic census to the 2017 economic census, 104 of the cities, towns, villages, and boroughs that we publish in New Mexico had some type of boundary change. For metropolitan areas, there is now a new micropolitan statistical area for Ruidoso that we now are recognizing in the 2017 economic census that did not exist in the 2012. So when you're using data, I always tell people before you start making a comparison about how the economy of Albuquerque has changed over the last 10 years, you want to make sure that the boundaries of Albuquerque haven't in fact changed. In fact, they have. So when you're making that comparison, you have to know what that boundary change was so that you can then make an informed decision about whether or not that change, that boundary change, is significant enough for your purposes that you would want to address it. You'd want to account for it in that comparison. We provide a lot of geographic materials at the Census Bureau that help you do that comparison and then look at those changes. And I even recommend that even people who are not even using Census Bureau data use these geographic resources when they're doing those time series comparisons, because a lot of other data providers don't provide this type of comparison. They assume when they are comparing the data for Albuquerque for the last 20 years that the city boundaries have not changed, and they do. Similarly, you need to be thinking about industry changes. The North American Industry Classification System also gets updated every 5 years. On the slide, you can see the 6 sectors that had some type of change going from 2012 NAICS to 2017 NAICS: mining, manufacturing, retail, information, real estate, and the professional, scientific, and technical services sector all had changes. I can tell you that all of them impact New Mexico, especially the last one, professional, scientific, and technical services. This happens to be a sector that's quite strong in your state, it did have some changes. There's some brand new industries that we are now for the first time measuring in this particular sector. Now I'm going to skip the third bullet for a second and say that data.census.gov is now our enterprise dissemination platform. And yes, you need to learn about how to use that. American Fact Finder is gone. It will not be coming back. I'm sorry to say that. I was around when AFF was born, and I've been here to its demise. Data.census.gov has the promise of being even more, much more than what American Fact Finder was by its very design. So I'm hoping you all can be patient with that. The third bullet here is sort of the bummer slide for today, and that is that when we disseminate all of our data, we are bound by Title 13 of the U.S. Code to make sure that we don't publish information that would disclose the identity of individual people or individual businesses. Title 13 covers our data, and historically we have gone to great lengths to make sure that someone couldn't identify an individual business in our data. Now, in a state like California, where you have huge numbers of businesses, we are able to publish data down to very small levels of geography, individual cities and towns, even at the more detailed industry breakouts, because there's enough businesses in that industry, in that geography, that we don't have to worry about disclosure. That is not as true in New Mexico. New Mexico is a smaller state, certainly not geographically, but smaller in terms of the numbers of businesses. And when you start to slice and dice those businesses into detailed geographies, certainly for the counties in New Mexico that are very small in terms of total population, the number of businesses are also very small. We start to run into disclosure problems. And that's even using just our normal disclosure rules. For the 2017 Economic Census and for each of our 2017 programs after, or beyond the Economic Census, so county business patterns, non-employer statistics, we were required to implement some new disclosure rules that the Internal Revenue Service required us to do because our data are commingled with theirs, or maybe I should say the other way around. IRS data are commingled with Census Bureau data. These new disclosure rules have had an impact on the data for New Mexico. So the big tip for today is that whenever you're using data from the Economic Census, I always recommend that you start off, number one, at the largest level of geography that you are interested in. So let's say we start off at the state level, we then look at metropolitan area data, and then we move to county before we go down to city and town. Start off big, geographically big, but then also start off big in terms of industry coverage. I would very much recommend that you guys look at the data at the 2-digit NAICS level first. So for example, look at the retail trade data first before you then try to drill down specifically to new car dealers, for example. When you start off at the more aggregated NAICS levels and the more aggregated geography levels, the chance of having these suppressions is minimized, is less. The more detailed you go, the more detailed geography and the more detailed industry, the more chance there is going to be of suppressions. And I will tell you, having dug into the data for New Mexico quite a bit, that there are a lot of suppressions in the state. So it's a bit of a bummer, but I kind of feel like I really want to be open and honest with you all about this. Now, let's talk about ABS. As I mentioned before, the annual business survey is the replacement for the survey of business owners, and the replacement for the temporary survey, the annual survey of entrepreneurs. These programs publish data on business ownership based upon the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. Survey of Business Owners, SBO, included both employer businesses and non-employer businesses, self-employed people. And as you can imagine, there are far more minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, non-employer businesses than there are employer businesses in those categories. When we decided to create the annual business survey and make this an annual program, to keep the sample size reasonable, where we could still publish data at the county, metro, and place levels, we had to back off on the types of businesses that were covered. So currently, the ABS only covers employer businesses. It does not cover the non-employers. Now, before you start yelling and screaming, that's sort of a bummer. There are plans in place that are underway to add the non-employer data back to ABS. Fingers and toes crossed that might happen as early as next year. But before that happens, one tip that I have for you all is that you can use the self-employment data from the ACS, the data on employment for people say, I am self-employed. You could add that data and the race ethnicity that's available from the ACS for that data to the ABS data to come up with an approximation of the number of minority, women, veteran, et cetera, owned businesses in New Mexico. So there is sort of a way of coming at it. There are certainly some caveats when you would do that, and I would certainly be happy to chat with you all if you want to sort of consider doing that, to point out some of the things you need to, you're going to need to assume, or that you're just going to need to sort of accept, as opposed to, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it. ABS is a really nice program because it also has some other types of data that was never in the SBO. Information on how long the business has been in business, years in business, the receipt size, the employment size, and a bunch of owner and business characteristics are all published in ABS. Some of those were in SBO, but a lot of them weren't. In terms of geography, data are available at the nation and state level at the full NAICS. So if you're looking for, if you wanted to know how many Native American owned businesses are there in New Mexico, down to more detailed industries, you can get that data from ABS. If you wanted to then go in and look at that data broken out by county and metropolitan area, you need to look at it for NAICS 00. There is no NAICS detail. There's no retail, wholesale, manufacturing. It's just a total. Now, you'll notice that I did highlight here county and metro. I did not highlight place. I will tell you that the place level data in New Mexico from this survey is extraordinarily thin, to the point that I would not even recommend even digging into it, because you're not going to find really anything there. You're going to really need to look at the data at the county and metro level. Now, I did just notice, popped up while we were chatting, someone asked a question about how do we deal with these data suppressions. Typically in our data tables, when we have to withhold the information for a particular industry and geography due to suppressions, you would actually see the letter D, an uppercase D in the table. That would indicate that we've had to withhold that data due to disclosure. Under these new disclosure rules, though, there are cases where all of the data, the entire row of data in that table would then be D'd, and in those cases, this new rule has determined that we now have to remove that row completely from the table. So when you now look at our published tables, just because you don't see a row for a particular county, for a particular industry, doesn't mean that there are no businesses in that industry in that county. It may mean that there are some, but there were so few that we had to suppress the data. And I will also just remind everybody that saying that there were so few, quote unquote, doesn't necessarily mean that those businesses were small. You have some fairly large companies in New Mexico that are the only company in a particular industry in that county. In that particular case, this could be a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and we would have to suppress the data simply because they are the only one that are in that county. So just a tip when you're using our business data. The positive, the upside of all of these suppressions is that the quality of the data that we publish is a lot higher than it would be if we didn't have those privacy protections, because businesses know that we are truly committed to protecting their privacy. I can tell you as a subject matter analyst who reviewed these data for quite some time, I talked to a lot of businesses who told me that we were one of the only organizations that they reported accurately to, because they knew that we would protect the privacy of their proprietary data. Now, just to give you some tips, some information from the 2017 ABS report. This is a table or a chart that I created looking at the number of employer firms in New Mexico by veteran status, by race, ethnicity, and sex. You can clearly see, going from left to right, that there are far more non-veteran-owned businesses in New Mexico than there are veteran or equally veteran or non-veteran-owned. There's far more white-owned businesses in New Mexico than the other categories. There are far more non-minority-owned businesses in New Mexico than minority or equally minority or non-minority, and there are far more non-Hispanic-owned businesses. Same thing on the male side. There's far more male-owned businesses. Now, the very last bar here is unclassifiable. What that means is that these are businesses that we cannot classify by veteran status, race, ethnicity, or gender. These are corporations, for example, that we can't classify. You can't say, is that company, that publicly traded company, is that a white-owned business? You can't say that. So these non-classifiable businesses, when you're thinking of number of businesses, are relatively small. But when you look at the revenue of those unclassifiable businesses, which you'll see in just a moment, the revenue of those businesses is often really high. So there's not very many of them, but the revenue of them is higher than some of the other categories. This is looking at women-owned businesses in New Mexico. I thought it would be interesting to kind of look at, when you think of the sectors of the U.S. economy that there are more women-owned businesses in than others. I thought that it was quite interesting that there are far more women-owned healthcare businesses in New Mexico than any other. But even more interesting, I thought that it was fascinating that the second-ranked sector was actually professional, scientific, and technical services. In most states, retail trade is also either number one or number two. So the fact that there are so many women-owned businesses in this particularly high-tech sector that includes a lot of pretty highly paid workers, I thought was really quite something. Looking at some county-level data, I think this should come as no surprise to you that when you look at minority-owned businesses in the state of New Mexico, Bernalillo County clearly dominates the other county in terms of the numbers of minority-owned businesses. Doña Ana and Santa Fe County are second and third ranked. Sandoval County fourth ranked. But again, just to give you an idea of the kind of distribution of data that are available, I will say that there were 16 counties in New Mexico where we had to suppress the data for minority-owned businesses, and the sum of the firms in those 16 counties was 773 firms, which is about 10% of the total number of firms in the state. So that was somewhat, I was somewhat happy to see that. Often in some states, the suppressed cells become a very large percentage of the total. The fact that those 16 suppressed counties accounted for a relatively speaking small percentage of the total for the state did give me some solace. So let's now jump out live, and I actually want to show you all the COVID-19 Data Hub, since I know that was going to be something that we were going to be very interested in doing. So let me jump out live here to census.gov, and from the main Census Bureau homepage, we used to have a link right to the COVID Hub right here on the main census.gov page, but as we were getting close to the completion of the 2020 census, they gave the real estate back over to 2020. So currently, to get to the COVID-19 resource, you have to go to Browse by Topic and then choose Emergency Management. From the Emergency Management page that has information on the hurricanes and fires and floods that have been going on. This has been a crazy year. I heard that we're now at iota. If you choose the coronavirus pandemic icon and then click on the COVID image, you come to our coronavirus main resource page. On this resource page, we have a link to the hub itself. Below there, we have links to the 4 programs that were specifically created to measure data on the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. So the first is business formation statistics and the small business pulse survey. And then on the demographic side, we have the community resilience estimates and household pulse. I'll talk about these 4 programs in just a moment. At the very top of the page, again, we have the link to the hub. Version 1.5 is the current version. We are currently working on an update for version 1.6, and this will be such a major update that we're actually considering calling it 2.0, and I'll explain what that update is in just a moment. So when you come to the COVID website, at the very top of the page, you see 4 basic statistics from our demographic programs and our economic programs. The population is 65 and over, the uninsured population, total number of employer businesses, and the total number of non-employer businesses. Below there, we come to what we call the Impact Planning Report. And I'm going to go ahead and click on it so you can see it in its own full-size dashboard, image. But this provides selected statistics from the American Community Survey and from 2 of our business surveys. This is a 2-page visualization. The first page has data mix of the population data. There's some business data here. There's some health insurance coverage. On the second page, this is all data from the American Community Survey. Now, you'll notice that the application automatically defaults to New York. We needed to pick a state for it to default to. That was the state that seems like it has been hammered the most by the pandemic. But yes, you can, of course, choose New Mexico from the list. So I'm going to go down and choose the data for New Mexico. The impact report will then refresh, and we'll now be looking at demographic and business data for the state of New Mexico. There's about 80 ACS variables in this particular report. These variables were chosen based upon some risk factors that were provided to us by CDC and HHS and a number of other emergency management organizations who said that these were the main factors that they were very concerned about or interested in looking at when they're thinking about the potential impacts of the COVID pandemic. Now, in addition to looking at the data at the state level, I can also go in and look at the data by county. So I'm going to choose Bernalillo County here, and the report's now going to refresh, and it's now going to show the data specifically for Bernalillo County. These reports are all fully manipulable. So if I wanted to look at, of these 15,964 businesses in Bernalillo County, how many of them are restaurants that we all know are ones that have been significantly impacted? I could then see that in Bernalillo County, there's 1,242 restaurants and other eating places, which is NAICS 7225. Doctor's offices, 6211, 348 of those, et cetera. So you do have these sort of most impacted industries displayed. In version 1.6/2.0, we are going to be updating this to show sector-level data instead of these detailed industries because we have learned that a lot of other businesses have been impacted other than just these ones here. So we decided to provide a slightly more detailed breakout. All of the data in this report can be downloaded, and of course you can print the report as well. Now scrolling down below the report, we then come to those 4 different programs. Business Formation Statistics is a program that was created to help measure the impact on new business, on startups from the pandemic. Now, as you can imagine, if I was interested in starting a business during this pandemic, I might say, maybe this isn't such a great idea. Maybe I ought to hold off on applying for my employer identification number with the IRS and wait until I have more time to be able to, wait until the pandemic is starting to get past before I apply for my EIN. This is a weekly program that we have been updating since the beginning of the pandemic that shows information about how many people have applied for an EIN in that week with the IRS. If I had looked at this application, at this tool, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I would see a huge drop in the number of applications of business formations, where now we're starting to see that really begin to ramp up. The application automatically defaults to nation, but we can, of course, go in and choose data specifically for New Mexico. And the application is now going to zoom in specifically on New Mexico, and then all of the information that I'm going to be seeing is going to be specifically for the state of New Mexico. So it is a nice way to go in and actually look at startups that are beginning to happen. And I can look at the data for a particular week, or I can choose a range of weeks. I can see how has that been changing over time, et cetera. So this is a nice program. I'm just giving you all a very, very quick overview of these. I would encourage you all to check it out yourself. The second COVID-related program that we stood up was the Small Business Pulse Survey. As you can imagine, small businesses happen to be one of the types of businesses that has been most impacted by the pandemic. These businesses don't have the resources in many cases to weather a shock like a pandemic. So we created a special survey to actually measure the impact of them. The data for this survey are published at the national, state, and metropolitan area levels. This tool lets you go in and actually browse the data for the nation and states, but I can also go down and drill down to metropolitan areas as well. It allows you to choose the particular question. So in this case, we're looking at overall impact, but I could also go in and say, how are businesses seeing a change in revenue? Have they seen an increase in revenue, a decrease in revenue, or no change in the last week? And of course, the tool does allow you to go in and actually look at the data for detailed states. So I can go in and I can choose state and metropolitan area, and then I can actually choose the state of New Mexico and actually be able to compare New Mexico to other states around. So if I wanted to turn off all the states and just select New Mexico, I can do that as well. There's all kinds of menus to be able to go in and actually select this. If I want to look at the different survey answers, the different questions. There is a time series comparison. It's a little hard to see it here because of the way my screen resolution is set up. But for the questions that we've asked over the entire time frame, you can see how businesses are beginning to respond, how there's actually beginning to be a recovery, that some of these businesses that were really getting hammered at the beginning started to recover, but now that we're starting to see an uptake again, increase again in the number of cases and infections and deaths, et cetera, we're starting to see small businesses once again get impacted. This particular survey just completed phase 2, and they are going to be conducting a phase 3 for the Small Business Pulse Survey. It will start at the beginning of December, and then it'll continue through the beginning of January, or excuse me, the end of November, and then continue through the beginning of January, and those data will be available here in this hub as well. The third program here is the Household Pulse Survey. And you notice that there isn't a specific dashboard just for the Household Pulse Survey. When you click on this link here, it's going to bring me out to the main household pulse survey page. I can then utilize their interactive tool to actually browse the information. And once again, this tool does let me go in and specifically look at both states and metropolitan areas. So I can go in and choose the data for New Mexico and look at how are households in New Mexico reacting to the pandemic. I want to make a very important point to say that this visualization just provides about a half dozen or so of the main questions that are asked. Did the household experience a loss in employment income? Did the household have to change how they work, that workers are now teleworking? Did the household experience any food scarcity, et cetera? But this survey has much, much more data than just simply these dozen. There's a lot of additional information available for download. So if you've been using this visualization thinking that that's all that there is, there's way more out there. They have not yet stood up a phase 3 of the Household Pulse Survey. Finally, the Community Resilience Estimates Program is another program that was stood up specifically to measure the potential impacts of this pandemic. And what CRE does that's really quite interesting is it applies 11 risk factors and identifies geographies that have or that meet none of those risk factors, one of the risk factors, two of the risk factors, or three or more of the risk factors. And obviously, those communities, those counties that have more than the three or more risk factors, those counties are then viewed to be less resilient to something like this pandemic than a county that may have none of the risk factors or only one or two of the risk factors. Now, right now, this program was created where the 11 risk factors that were chosen and applied to the American Community Survey data were specifically provided to us by the Center for Disease Control and the Health and Human Services Administration, and they identified the ones that they felt were the most important risk factors to consider for something like a pandemic. However, this program is already considering a life beyond COVID. They are already planning for keeping this program alive and changing those risk factors to be risk factors that would be more appropriate for things like fires or floods or hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes. Obviously, if you think about the risk factors for a community that would experience a hurricane, those risk factors might be very different from the risk factors that you would associate with a pandemic. The ability to have a car to be able to escape during a fire or during a hurricane, that might be very important, where having a car might not be as important for something like a pandemic. Where are you going to escape to? So this is another really good program. I love telling people about the CRE data. Now, below these four COVID-related surveys is then some policy maps. There are 8 maps here. This is the map specifically from county business patterns, and I can actually zoom in on New Mexico, and I can specifically look at data on the number of businesses and employment establishments per payroll by county. The data are available here, and the same type of breakouts are also available for non-employers. There's some information on household income, households that have less than $75,000 worth of household income, households that have percentage of people below the poverty level, et cetera. So I can go in and actually browse this data in these maps. These maps were specifically designed to be shared. So if you are a GIS professional and you want to incorporate these maps into your own particular displays, you would be able to do that using the share feature. But we also then, at the bottom over here, give you direct access to the data itself. So we have a couple of highlighted data sets, and then below there we have these categorical data set searches. So if I was interested in some demographic characteristics, I could go have some particular, choose one of those categories, and then I can go ahead and download this data either as a feature layer to bring right into ArcGIS, or I can download it as an Excel file. Now, I mentioned before that we were going to be making a pretty substantial change to this platform in version 1.6. Down here at the bottom of the page, after the COVID surveys but before these policy maps, we are going to be inserting a whole new section that includes links to 42 other state and federal government data sets that are specifically related to the COVID-19 pandemic. For the last 6 months or so, SEMA has been working with these other federal agencies to gather the data that they need or that they felt was important to understand the potential impacts of the pandemic. Those include data sets from BEA, from BLS, from HHS, and from a variety of other agencies, including even U.S. Department of Agriculture. Currently, those data sets are being hosted on the Oregon National Labs website, and that website is password protected. You need to have access to that tool, to that application. They would like to make that data more accessible to a larger audience. So they contacted me and my colleague Chip Walker and said, would you guys be able to add to your COVID-19 hub links to these 42 additional data sets that would allow people to have one place that they can go to get data not only from the Census Bureau about COVID-19, but also to be able to get data from these other agencies. And as you can imagine, we said, of course we'd be willing to do that. Our senior managers were very excited to hear that we have these other agencies so interested, so happy with what we've done with this platform that they want to share their data on it as well, and they can actually go in. And so we're now going to be doing that. So hopefully when that goes live, we're going to be doing a webinar specifically on that edition. So basically, that was my demo that I wanted to kind of walk through. Let me jump back out over here to my PowerPoint file. And let's see, did I have anything else I want to talk about? Okay, so let's kind of summarize. So the Economic Census has an amazing wealth of data. We would encourage you guys to check it out. There's still more data coming. We want you to use that information. We think it's pretty powerful. I will tell you selfishly from my standpoint, there are a couple of data users in the state of New Mexico whose stories of them using their data, using Census Bureau data, was so impactful that I continue to this day to still call them out and talk about how great it was that these businesses that use census data do some really great things. So I'm really happy about that. My second major point here on the summary is that when you're doing those time series comparisons, please, please, please make sure the thing that you're comparing is comparable. We have a lot of resources available. I provided the links here to both our geographies page and to the NAICS website, where you can go in to learn more about those geography and NAICS changes. And then finally, we talked about the COVID-19 Data Hub, and then I mentioned that we're going to be adding this brand new FEMA data. Here is my email address and my phone number. So if anybody has any questions that you don't want to ask here during the webinar, please feel free to contact me at my email address or phone number. My phone does eventually roll over to my Census Bureau cell phone. So Susan, let's see, does anybody have any questions? I was trying to kind of pay attention to them as I was going, but I didn't. I'm sure I missed some of them.
Well, the first one is on the new business formation statistics. Can you see that by industry code?
So BFS has data by sector, NAICS sector. So you would be able to see of those business formations, how many of them were manufacturing formations, retail formations, accommodation, food services, the two-digit NAICS sectors. There is not data broken out by detailed industry in there, but you're not the first person who has asked for that, and we've actually already put in a request to see is there any way of getting more detailed data on that. Now, again, these are These are people who have requested an employer identification number with the IRS. BFS is actually a program that we've had at the Census Bureau for decades, but historically we only publish the data once every year. When we started seeing this massive drop-off in business formations during the beginnings of the pandemic, we realized that instead of us queuing up that data and sitting on it until the end of the year, why don't we just start publishing it literally as we are receiving it from the IRS? So we talked with them, and they said, yeah, sure, go for it. So that's where this weekly BFS came from. And it really is kind of fascinating to see how much those formations reduced, how bad it was at the beginning, but how they're beginning to come back.
So the next question is actually from me, but it's actually really a footnote, so I can talk about this. And one of the charts there where you showed county data, and it was showing poverty for Rio Arriba County.
Right.
There's no data for Rio Arriba County.
Right.
And I happen to know it's actually because of American Community Survey. In 2018, they had a data problem for Rio Arriba County, and most of the Rio Arriba County data for 2018 is suppressed. So for those of you who are looking for data for Rio Arriba County, just be aware that you either have to step back to the 2017 data for Rio Arriba County, or you have to look at a different program. Specifically, if you're looking for the poverty data, and I've had this question come up 2-3 times in the last couple of weeks, actually step out to the small area income poverty estimates for that data instead of American Community Survey.
Right. Did you talk to them about what's going to happen with the 2019 ACS 5-year estimates data, Susan?
I have not heard yet. I just have hopes that we'll have data for Rio Arriba County.
Yeah, you are very observant when you saw that hole in the middle of the state. So I had noticed it too when I was checking out the data for New Mexico. I had that same question, and I have been told that it likely will be fixed for the December release of the 2019 ACS estimates. I don't know if that's definitely going to happen, but I was told that there's a good chance it might be.
We will have our fingers crossed. So does anybody else have any questions? You know, we only have about 53 people on right now, so it's okay, I think, if you unmute and ask your question. But now's the time, because we have Andy Hait here, and he is as always, when he presents, I always learn something new and have several takeaways from his presentation.
So, Susan, I did just see someone brought up a question in the chat talking about the reliability of our survey data. I will tell you, and I will openly and honestly admit that I am a little biased because I have worked at the Census Bureau for 33 years, but our survey data is really quite good. We, number one, tend to conduct sample surveys with much larger sample sizes than a lot of other data providers. The annual survey of manufacturers, for example, that covers the manufacturing sector is an annual survey that has over 60,000 businesses in that sample survey. So our sample sizes tend to be fairly large. Number two, we tend to be very conservative. Some might argue ridiculously conservative when it comes to the level of detail that we're willing to show based upon those sample surveys. So there might be programs, for example, that are willing to conduct a 5% sample survey and get a 10% response rate to that 5% sample survey and publish that data down to individual census tracts. We would never do that. So we are pretty conservative when it comes to the level of geography and industry breakouts that we publish to make sure that the data are reliable, that you're not going to see really weird things in the data that are simply a function of a small sample size. So when I said earlier in my presentation that the monthly economic indicators are these really, really timely programs, but we only publish data at the national level, The reason why that is because we personally don't think that data are accurate enough to be able to slice and dice that data down to smaller levels of geography. Now, that doesn't mean that other data users might not feel that they are. In fact, I can tell you, as being someone who has used a lot of other data from other data providers, our nerdiness is pretty unique. There are a lot of data providers out there that take leaps of faith with their survey data that we wouldn't take. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just something that we all ought to be aware of when you're looking at that data. Another reliability related questions that I'll mention is that we are pretty nerdy when it comes to reviewing the data. I spent 9 years, my first 9 years at the Census Bureau, as an analyst reviewing the data for the chemicals industry. We look very closely at the reported data. We will correct businesses that say that they say we're supposed to be in industry X when their data indicates that they really are in industry Y. Yes, there are some incentives for businesses to report the incorrect NAICS code, and we are very nerdy when it comes to that from a reliability standpoint. And then the final point I want to make on here is that we have a pretty blanket rule at the Census Bureau that if we don't get at least 70% of the businesses to respond to that survey for that industry, for that geography, we will suppress the data. I mentioned a moment ago that there are organizations that conduct 5% sample surveys and are thrilled with a 10 or 20% response rate. That would put us into cardiac arrest. So we insist upon a level of response. And because most of our surveys are mandatory, we can actually go back after those companies that have not responded to get them to respond. So we are pretty nerdy about it. Now, with all of that said, I will tell you that these 4 brand new COVID-related programs are called experimental data products for a very important reason. They are experimental. They do not follow some of the normal rules that I just mentioned about responses, and we are very open and honest about that to tell people that, yes, these data are really, really useful, but you need to know that we've only had a 30% or 40% response rate, not our normal 70% minimum. So we are pretty particular about making sure that we let people know that the data do not follow our normal rules. I will tell you, in my 33 years at Census, I have never seen us stand up a survey as quickly as we stood up these 4 COVID-related programs, and it's really testament to the work of our staff at Census who did that, and the Office of Management and Budget, who gave us the authority, gave us the approval to conduct these surveys. So that's a really great was a really great question. Another question I saw that just came in is asking about are we permitted to cross-check our survey results with IRS actual income data? So the answer to that question is the Census Bureau has a one-way working relationship with a number of other federal statistical agencies, and the IRS is one of them. Yes, we can pull statistics that businesses have reported to the IRS, and we compare that IRS reported data with the data that the business reported to us in our surveys. However, it is a one-way street. We are prohibited by law from pushing data back to the IRS, and I can tell you, having been an analyst in our subject matter areas for 9 years and having worked with those folks for a lot of other years after them, there are a lot of times where a business reports one thing to the IRS and something different to the Census Bureau, and our census data are more accurate. In a lot of respects, the IRS doesn't really care what industry your business is classified in. We really do care. So we typically don't use the IRS classification of the business. The main reason why we pull that data not only is to be a check against our data, But for cases where a business did not respond to the survey, we use the IRS data as a proxy for what their census response would have been. There also are a couple of programs at the Census Bureau that are completely administrative surveys. We don't actually conduct a survey. We only use administrative data. So county business patterns and non-employer statistics both are programs that are completely administrative programs. We don't actually conduct a county business pattern survey. What we do is we do a lot of edits to that IRS data that we pull because we discover things, we notice things in the data that we get from them that just doesn't make sense. It's a little frightening thought that someone might say, I'm a non-employer hospital. That is not possible. So every single year we get businesses reporting to the IRS that they're a hospital and they have no employees, we correct that. We make them a clinic or something else. So yes, we do cross-check the results. We use the IRS data as a proxy for non-response, but we do not push anything back to the IRS nor other federal agencies as well. So yeah, great question. Okay, another question I saw that came in here was asking about employment data by census tract by major employment type, so sectors, et cetera. So as you may have seen in my slide on the economic census, the kind of the details that are covered, I mentioned that the census, economic census publishes data at the national, state, metropolitan area, county, place, and we do publish in one program zip code level data. We do not, in our economic programs, publish data by census tract, and that is primarily because of disclosure. Obviously, if you try to slice and dice businesses down to individual census tracts, you would find lots of cases where in a particular census tract there may only be one grocery store or one nail salon or one doctor's office. And in all those cases, we couldn't publish the data because it would be a privacy violation of that business. However, the American Community Survey does publish, quote unquote, employment data. Those data are available down to census tract. But what I would tell you is, and the data are published by industry and occupation, so they do have these 2-digit NAICS sector level totals. But I would encourage you all to read the fine print when you are using that employment related data from the ACS, because there's a couple of very important factors. Number one, that employment data are tabulated based upon where the household, where the person lives, not where the business is physically located. The business data that we publish at the Census Bureau is based upon where the business is physically located. So it is a very different geography. In New Mexico, you have people that live in one county and work somewhere else. That happens a lot. Okay? You may even have people that live in Bernalillo County and telework with a business in California. Would you want to count those workers as if they were working in Bernalillo County, or would you want to count them as if they're working in California? On the econ side, we would say that worker is an employee of a business that's physically located in California. On the ACS, because it's a household-based survey, it's based upon where they live. Also, the ACS typically shows data for the primary occupation, the primary industry. So if you have a worker who may have 2 or 3 jobs, they will pick the one job that they consider their primary job, and that is then the employment and that is then captured in that particular category for that census tract. So you might have people that say, I am primarily a teacher because that's the job that I spend the most time on, but I actually also earn money as some other type of, as a tutor, let's say. So there are some caveats to using that ACS data by census tract when you're thinking about employment that I just want to encourage people to be aware of. I will also tell you that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does publish detailed employment data. I send people to BLS all the time for the quarterly census of employment and wages, but those data are only available down to the county level. They are not down to census tract. Okay, I did see another question here about how does the census determine the NAICS outside of BLS QCW? So in those other programs, like the BLS QCW, in the IRS reported data, the business themselves chooses their NAICS code. They say, I am a doctor's office, and I'm going to choose my particular NAICS code. At the Census Bureau, we use that person-selected NAICS code, that business-selected NAICS code as the starting point, but we then look at the other data that business has reported, and we then potentially change the NAICS code to say, well, based upon the data that you just reported, you could not be in that industry. You have to be in a different industry. And very often we'll then contact that business to say, you said that you were a doctor's office, but in looking at your revenue data, it looks like you're making way more money from in your business for PT, for physical training or physical therapy sessions. So you're really a physical therapist, not just a regular doctor. Maybe you're a chiropractor as opposed to a regular doctor. So we will look at the reported data and then assign the NAICS code ourselves based upon that data. It's really important thing from the Census Bureau's quality perspective because NAICS is confusing. There are some industry codes that are really easy and easy to understand. There's other ones that are not easy, that are a little bit more challenging to understand. So having us do that assignment, getting that business in the right industry is a pretty important part of the work that we do at Census. And I will tell you, and I alluded to this earlier, there are actually some businesses that would prefer to be considered in a certain industry and not the industry that they actually are in, because there are other federal agencies that would say, if you are in industry X, you are exempt from these certain rules, but if you're in industry Y, you are subject to these other rules. So, for example, and this is probably true in New Mexico, scattered all across the United States are tens of thousands of small agricultural wholesale businesses. Businesses that sell grain and seed and feed and tractor parts and all kinds of stuff to local farmers in that area. Many of those businesses have a fertilizer blending operation where the farmer will come in with a soil sample. They will test that soil. They will determine what nutrients are missing from the soil, and they will mix up a custom fertilizer blend for that farmer. If more than 50% of the sales of that business come from that fertilizer blending operation, that operation no longer is considered a wholesale business. It's considered a manufacturer. And as you can imagine, federal agencies like OSHA and EPA have special rules that apply to manufacturers that may not apply to wholesalers. This is actually an example that I personally experienced in my career at Census, where we had businesses that were intentionally reporting themselves as wholesalers when in fact the vast majority of their sales were coming from fertilizer blending, but they did not want to be considered a fertilizer manufacturer because if they did, they would then have to do all the eye wash stations and all of the other containment facilities and everything else that these other agencies require. So there is some reason in some industries for businesses to report themselves in a different NAICS code. So that's a great question. Okay, I did see a question here. Do we drill down to the tribal level? So in the Survey of Business Owners and in that new annual business survey, we do publish data on Native American-owned businesses. But those data are not published by tribal geography. In fact, none of the business surveys that we conduct in the Census Bureau publish data by tribal geography. It is I'm going to try to be nice here. It has been something that I have been complaining about for 20 years, that there are a lot of states, including New Mexico, that would really like to be able to see how many people and how many businesses live and are on tribal lands, as opposed to using the regular geography, regular states, counties, cities, et cetera, metropolitan areas. I am hopeful that in time for the 2022 Economic Census, we will begin to start publishing tribal data, tribal geography level data. It does create some challenges, and I will warn you, it could result actually in suppression of data from other more standard geography for New Mexico, because when you think about how tribal boundaries overlap with county boundaries, sometimes those overlaps could in of themselves cause a disclosure problem, a suppression problem, and that's really been the biggest reason why we have not been showing tribal data. As I'm sure you all know, we do publish tribal geography in our other demographic programs. The American Community Survey has a whole wealth of data broken out by tribal geography. So yeah, great question. That's one thing I love about this group, is you guys aren't afraid to ask me these really hard questions. Okay.
That is excellent, Andy. Thank you so much for your time and your presentation. For those of you left here, our next session will be at 1:30 this afternoon, and it'll feature Susanna Prevet, and she's going to do a session on census data basics, how to find data, specifically using data.census.gov. So I look forward to those of you who will be in this afternoon session.